After many years of estrangement, whether it's 20 years or 34, depending on who you ask, Jacob is finally on his way home when he is, as you heard this morning, confronted by his brother Esav, his enemy, who is surrounded by 400 troops, warriors, generals, ready for the kill. I want to invite us to pay close attention for a moment to what Jacob, our ancestor, does. He is greatly terrified and distressed, the Torah says. So he divides up all of the people who are with him, all of his flocks and herds and camels, into two camps. His thinking, the Torah says, is this: if Esav attacks one camp, at least the other camp will survive. Imagine looking at your family and community that way. Then he prays, "Deliver me, God, from my brother's hand, lest he come and strike me down along with my wives and my children." He then sends servants ahead with barrels of gifts for Esav, selected from his finest she-goats and he-goats and rams. At this point, Esav and the warriors are on one side of the Yabok River, and Jacob and his people are on the other. But then, as the night descends, Jacob brings forward his family, his wives, and his children with them, and he crosses the Yabok toward the enemy. And then something very strange happens. Jacob turns around and goes back over the river. So now his whole family is on one side, the side where the enemy is positioned, ready to pounce, and Jacob alone is on the other side. Vayivater Yaakov levado, Jacob is left alone, and it's there that he spends the night. This, we might say, is the opposite of a hero story. Just as the moment of confrontation approaches, our protagonist, the only one in the camp that Esav actually has beef with, abandons his family in harm's way and sneaks off in the dark of night. Now, the rabbis are forever loyal to Jacob, and they just can't accept this act of cowardice, so they start to spin stories. The Ibn Ezra explains that Jacob went back over the river for a final look to see if anything had been left behind, just cleaning out the campsite. Nothing to see here. And similarly, the rabbis in the Talmud in Chulin 91a, they teach that Jacob recrosses the stream at night in order to recover some small clay pitchers, pachin ktanim, that he had left behind. This reminds me, by the way, of an incident with my brother-in-law a few years ago when we were hiking at Kearsarge Pass in the Sierra Nevadas. We were only feet from the peak of the steepest and scariest serpentine path that I have ever traversed when one of the cousins dropped his Nalgene, the water bottle, and we watched it slide down off the side of a cliff. And I'm sorry to share this in front of my in-laws, but without hesitation, I witnessed my brother-in-law slide down right after it to recover it. Because the law of camping is that you have to leave it better than you found it. Now, he's a very experienced camper, so he knew what he was doing, and thank God he was okay, and thank God so is the Nalgene. But it seemed very extreme to me, as does this behavior. And here, perhaps even more implausible. The war with Esav is imminent. Why would Jacob leave his loved ones so vulnerable all night just to go back and collect a Nalgene? So here, I have to remind myself that the study of Torah has been a source of spiritual strength and vitality for our people for generations. So I imagine generations of students sitting in the Beit Midrash, in the house of study, trying to parse out the meaning of the clay pitchers. Why is it so important that our forefather would risk or even abandon his whole family? Of course, the rabbis will argue that this only shows that Jacob is truly holy and righteous. He recognizes that everything he owns, every material object, is a gift from the Holy One, and therefore he will leave no clay pitcher behind. They say that Jacob was so humble that his property was more precious than his own body. Well, as the Gen X gun violence activists might say, I call BS. Or as my lawyer friends might say, it's Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the right one. Or as the psychologist in the room might say, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Sometimes a thing is exactly what it seems. So why does our ancestor Jacob run back across the water, imperiling the lives of his beloved family? Because he's out of his mind with fear. He is terrified by this imminent encounter with his brother, who he believes wants to kill him, and so he wants to flee. The text actually is explicit about his fear. Vayira Yaakov me'od, vayetzer lo. He is terrified, and he is trembling. So now our ancestor Jacob is afraid, he is alone, and apparently he's very tired because eventually he falls asleep. And it's then that the angel comes to wrestle with him through the night. Again, we're going to see a dispute between the rabbis. What's the meaning of the angel wrestling with Jacob? Who does the angel represent? Is this an externalization of Jacob's inner anguish? Is it Esav's guardian angel, as Rashi argues? Is it just a strange man covered in dust, as Ramban argues? Here, in the spirit of Occam's razor, I will turn to the interpretation of Rashbam, Rashi's grandson. The angel is there for one reason and one reason only: to stop Jacob from running away, to force him to confront what he would rather avoid at all cost. Listen, the pull away from one another is profound today. We are hurt, we feel betrayed, we are dismayed. Like Jacob, we are full of grief, we are full of fear, we are traumatized. Perhaps we, like Jacob, are holding some measure of unresolved guilt about the ways that we might have contributed to the reality that we find ourselves in today. And the problems that we're facing are not easily resolved. Some of them may, in fact, be intractable. So I get why we want to run away. Please, Hulu, please give us The Bear season 4 already. And please make it more like season 2 than 3. Have we not suffered enough? But here, you know what I'm saying? Right? But here's the reality for us and for our ancestor Jacob. We cannot run away. Esav will eventually find us. History will eventually catch up to us. So I have been practicing trying to step closer when every muscle in my body, when every part of my heart is telling me to run away. Yes, I wanted to run back across the Yabok when I bumped into 30 teenagers at my gate in the airport a couple of weeks ago, just after the election, wearing hats celebrating the other team. And I'm not talking about the Dallas Cowboys. Instead, I asked them if they could tell me what this movement meant to them. We talked for 90 minutes. I asked a lot of questions. They answered respectfully and thoughtfully, and they even asked me some questions too. Don't worry, I still think they're wrong. And I am fairly certain that they feel the same way about me. But after talking to these kids for an hour and a half, they were no longer flat caricatures. They were just people with bad ideas. And while I don't believe that seeking human understanding is a panacea, I noticed that throughout the course of our long conversation, as I shared what that movement that they were celebrating felt like for so many Americans, I noticed that nearly all of them removed their red hats. I had to fight hard to stay at the table last week with a Palestinian community leader who had written last year that he was happy to see Palestinians break out of Gaza on October 7th, casting atrocities against my family as a positive step toward liberation. I was scared to sit at that table. But now, over a year later, he said, our pain is the same. Our blood is the same. I believe that the land is all mine, and you believe that it's all yours, but ultimately, we will have to share. It's hard to step toward when our hearts are inclining us to run away. But I sat in the past week with a rabbi who is a West Bank settler, who, when confronted with the reality of Jewish extremist violence against Palestinians, responded saying, you should see how we feel. We're confronted by their violence every day. I stayed at the table, and I heard him talk about how our most urgent task is to work together now to save lives. When we don't run away, we're forced to confront painful narratives, stories that it's hard sometimes to integrate into our own understanding. An imam last week told me about the scar on his face, which he got when he, more than 50 years ago, as a 6-year-old Palestinian child, was beaten by Israeli soldiers. I still have no idea why they did it, he said. And I still know that we need to make peace. This week, a Palestinian activist who I sat with challenged me to read the Torah in a way that is liberatory for all of us. She is a refugee. She spent her entire life trying to understand us, our community, and Jewish history and trauma so that she can understand her own family's suffering and so she can imagine how we might be able to move forward. She quoted Hanan Ashrawi to me. There is nothing I can do to make you feel safe enough to stop oppressing us. This was so hard for me to hear, but I'm glad that I heard it. This week, I sat with not one, but 2 optimists. While my heart was heavy with the dangerous inevitability of mass deportations just 6 weeks from now. While I have been consumed reading and thinking about a truly vile and insidious Supreme Court case regarding a Tennessee ban on gender-affirming care for trans youth, I sat this week with not one, but 2 people who remain clear-eyed about the dangers of this time for all of us, but nevertheless look at the world not through a lens of crisis, but instead through a lens of opportunity. They're optimistic right now. Can you imagine that? These conversations were challenging for me, and some of them were deeply uncomfortable. The very idea of sincere, open-hearted engagement is completely counter-instinctual for many of us, and all the more so now. I want to be really clear that I am not advocating surrender to the views of our ideological opponents. They're still wrong. I'm not even advocating that we compromise with them. I am not suggesting that sitting together takes the place of fighting to protect those among us who are the most vulnerable in our time. But what I am saying is that we cannot outrun one another. What I am proposing is a path between escape and capitulation. What I am suggesting is that we must find a way to the sacred recognition of one another's humanity, and that doing so does not diminish ours. In fact, it is essential to our own humanity. Our ancestor Jacob is a big, tired coward. He so desperately doesn't want to confront the other that he is willing to abandon his loved ones before an enemy of his own making. That is, as Rashbam indicates, until the angel appears, and Jacob is thrust against his will into the greatest struggle of his life. By the time the dawn emerges, he realizes that he can't escape history. He has to turn toward his estranged brother, precisely the person that he wants most in this world to avoid, and he does. And look what happens. Esav runs to greet him. He embraces him. He falls on his neck. He kisses him, and they weep. This is one of the great reconciliation stories of the Torah. That embrace, that kiss, those tears after a lifetime of heartache both of these men are transformed and healing has begun. Now here I am grateful to a friend, Rabbi Todd Berman, for sharing with me this week a teaching on this verse from the Netziv, from Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the great 19th century rabbinic commentator. They wept, he writes. They both cried. The fact that the verb is plural teaches us that the emotion of love overwhelmed not only Esav, but also Jacob. In other words, it is precisely in the midst of the most terrifying moment, the moment just before mutually assured destruction, that these brothers and their families are ultimately able to recognize each other's humanity. When Jacob felt that Esav respected his humanity, Berman writes, Jacob realized that they were brothers. And that is what enabled him to react with love. And most remarkably, Rabbi Berman points out that the Netziv wrote this commentary while living under an oppressive Russian regime in the Pale of Settlement, facing pogroms and violent oppression every day. Imagine that. Even still, he read in this sacred encounter an eternal message of hope through mutual respect and understanding. So powerful is the promise of reconciliation in our parsha that I am left wondering, had Jacob, our fearful ancestor, been more afraid of the battle with Esav or of the potential reconciliation? What does it mean when one's entire self-definition is rooted in being victimized or pursued by the other? How terrifying then is that kiss? How terrifying then is that embrace, that opening? Our story would have been so different had the angel not prevented Jacob from running away. The angel knew what we might all want to deny. It is only when they were able to meet face to face in all of their sorrow and their guilt and their grief that these two brothers were able to see one another's humanity. Must we not, I wonder, find a way to do the same? Shabbat Shalom.